This is a series of slides dealing with Romanesque architecture, which was the major style for large buildings, big public buildings, in the Middle Ages up to the middle or end of the 12th century. In that period there was a transition to the Gothic, but the Gothic is a topic for MMW4. This first structure that we're looking at is not a Romanesque building. I thought I would start with several slides that give you some of the background of early medieval buildings that would have been quite common actually throughout the period because they continued to be built and yet were overcome, so to speak, or anyway put in the shadow by the large Romanesque buildings we'll be seeing a little later on. This is actually called an oratory. It is a small chapel. Oratories sometimes were so small that they really were suitable for only 3 or 4 people. This one might take 10 or 15. It is a particular kind of building called a cruck house, which means it's all roof and no walls. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that, in effect, this is a building built with a roof sitting on the ground. It has no windows. The doorway you can look into somewhat and see how thick the stone wall is. It would be quite dark in there. If there was a hearth of any kind for keeping the place warm and lit, then there would be a hole in the roof somewhere to let the smoke out. But it's a very primitive building. It was probably built in the 7th century, but it cannot be dated accurately, and it is possible that it may have been built as late as the 11th century. But it certainly represents a very early stage of medieval stone building. You've read Beowulf. This is a nice representation of Hrothgar's Mead Hall. It is a palace in Sweden. It's been reconstructed, built circa 1000, so quite a bit later than the story of Beowulf, but representing a kind of building that goes back into the deep Germanic past. You can see that here too you're really dealing with a wall-less building. This is all roof. The roof timbers go all the way from the ground to the peak, but you have them resting on this framework of posts and beams, and these are the kinds of beams that play a role in the scene in Beowulf of the battle in the Mead Hall between Grendel and Beowulf. You'll note that in the center there's a hearthstone, or maybe 2. In some of these buildings there would have been what was called a long hearth, which would run down the center of the room. In this case it's a round hearth. The king's raised seat would be at the end of the building, and the tables and benches that the men sat on would be around the edges so that everybody could take advantage of the heat. There would be a hole in the roof, no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Inside these buildings, here very plain, would be quite a lot of decorations, hanging things often, like hanging shields and armor and swords and the like. And some of them very elaborately done, a little bit like Sutton Hoo, perhaps not that rich, but the king certainly might have such materials in his possession. But the inside of this building would not have been as simple and plain as it appears here. When used, it would be decorated with gilt, of silver, with enamel, with objects that gave it a certain kind of richness. Nonetheless, it's a pretty primitive place. This is another Irish church. It's also an oratory. It has come down with the name St. Kevin's Kitchen. Why, nobody really knows. You can see that here, a building of the 9th century, you're in a period in which houses are beginning, and this is a church, but it looks an awful lot like a house. In fact, there's a house in La Jolla that looks an awful lot like this one, and you would find many on the East Coast, particularly in the Northeast, that even have some of the same texture because they're made of stone. Here, the structure is really like an A. The roof is like an A. It has a barrel vault that serves, in effect, as the divider, the crossbar in the A. Above it is a very small, narrow space with sloping walls that could be used as a private chapel. Below it is a larger chapel. And one of the things that's striking about this little building is that its height is quite great compared to its size, to the area it covers. And architectural historians generally regard that as quite elegant. And I think it is an elegant building. You'll also note the round tower, which would have been a bell tower when this was used as a church. Here's another building that you might have seen in time of Beowulf. This is an Anglo-Saxon wooden church. The brick pedestal on which it's sitting is actually modern. It was built in there sometime probably in the 19th century to protect the wood. The style of this building goes way, way back. You can see that what it has is something called a palisade wall. The structure is built up with a frame inside, and then the wall is made of these logs, which are upright like a palisade would be. So in some respects, this is a log house. You can see that in a structure like this one, made of wood, you could break windows through and get light. And although, again, these windows themselves are quite modern, the dormers provided extra light from quite early on. This is a modern version. Modern in the sense 1822 is pretty modern compared to what we've been talking about. But it's a modern version of a very ancient form of church building. It has a kind of tongue-and-groove slatted wall. This one happens to be in Iceland. I saw something very similar years ago in Sweden, a 13th century version of this. Very small, only can get maybe 20 people into it. The interior was covered in murals. Those were painted in the 13th and 14th century. And so what you're looking at here is a very simple, a very common parish church kind of building that you would have seen in villages all over Europe from about the 9th century on. And in most places, of course, they could not afford to build expensive stone buildings, so wood is what they used, and most of those buildings, nearly all of those buildings, are gone. This elaborate and beautiful church is a Norwegian stave church. A stave church gets its name from the kind of construction that they used in the walls. They did tongue and groove, fitting these slats or staves together so that they linked with one another. It was very weatherproof and very stable. As you can see, they could build these churches up quite high, give them great interior height, but they were not very large. They didn't have large congregations using these kinds of churches. And this is what might be called a central space church in that it has no length to it. It's basically a square. You can see you can enter it from several different sides. I don't know whether you can enter it from the back. You probably couldn't because the altar would be against at least one of the walls. The interior and exterior of these churches were often carved and painted, and some of the carving was very elaborate. They have, not from this one, which is a mid-12th century exemplar, but from others that have otherwise disappeared. They saved some of those carved panels because they were so magnificent, and you can see those in various museums in Norway. This is Romanesque. The Romanesque style was inspired by the Romans, and therefore it grew up in regions of Europe where Roman remains, either buildings or ruins, still existed. That means, for the most part, Italy and the Mediterranean coast of France and Spain and so on, those areas where there were exemplars. The Romans used arches. You've seen that in the earlier slide lecture on Roman architecture. And they used arches, which are very strong, and they built a lot of public buildings in the form of a basilica, which was a rectangular shaped building with a flat wooden roof spanning quite a large space. So these buildings were often quite large. Here what you see is a basilica type building dating from the middle of the 11th century. It has an open beam ceiling. You see that from time to time, but more often what you see is a finished ceiling where you can't see the beamwork that is above it, and that ceiling is often painted, and you can see that this here has been decorated and painted. You can see that the ceiling is held up on a wall that itself is resting on an arcade. An arcade is an arched space, and you can see the line of arcades on both sides here. And every once in a while, I think it's every fourth of these pillars, is actually four half pillars put together, engaged with one another, as they say, which gave it very great strength. And those are the pillars that hold up the arches that are used to support the roof to give the roof additional support, which you can see in the foreground and then part of the way back. You can also see, as you look back in this church, that there is a raised area with steps with stairways on either side. That's the choir. I'll explain that a little bit more fully later on when we look at some plans, but basically the church has an altar at its east end. It always faces east toward Jerusalem. In some parts of Europe, they're very careful about exactly where Jerusalem is. In some cases, they just approximate it, but it always faces east. The altar's on the east side. The church usually ends in what's called an apse, which is a half-domed space that you can see here, and you can see the mosaic in this particular example of it in Florence. It can be a mosaic, it can be a fresco. It's a big wall painting of some kind or artwork of some kind. In many of these churches, including this one, which is a monastery church, you had the monks coming in 7 times a day to pray. They did not sit in the nave. The nave was for the lay public. So they stretched the church beyond the altar and built what is called a chancel or a choir. It can be called either. And that's where the monks sat. And in this case, the choir is raised nearly a whole floor, and underneath that would be the crypt. The crypt was a chapel that was used for special prayers, and usually not by the entire community of monks, but rather by small groups or individuals, and also had in it burial. So the monks, or their abbots at least, were buried in the floor or in the walls of the crypt. And in most cases, the crypt was a basement, but in many, many cases, we'll see some other examples, the crypt is actually above ground, and then the choir, or the chancel, is built above ground, and that's what's happened here. The floor, which is a marble mosaic floor, was actually put in 1207, so about a century and a half after the building was actually built. You can see that the decoration in this building, aside from what's in the apse, is done with multicolored marble. That's more common in Italy than anywhere else because they had that kind of marble. So this is a very nice example of a relatively early Romanesque church. You'll find that Romanesque architecture arises right around this time in the middle of the 11th century in its full-blown form, and then is replaced about the end of the 12th century, even though in northern France it was replaced somewhat earlier. The Gothic rises in the middle of the 12th century in northern France near Paris, but doesn't spread very quickly, and it's only in the 13th century that it really overwhelms Romanesque and takes over. Here's another Romanesque basilica. This one is at Monreale, which is southeast of Palermo. It looks like on the map about 50 miles, maybe it's a little less, in Sicily. You can see here too is a beam ceiling, like the one we've just looked at. It's supported by an arcade, and you can see some features of the typical Romanesque basilica here that you couldn't see as well in the previous illustration. For one thing, you can see that beyond the columns there are 2 aisles, one on either side, and that's quite common in any of the large churches. It could be used 2 ways. The congregation could come in from that side and then come into the center. Generally speaking, by the way, in the Middle Ages, there were no pews, there were no seats in any of these churches, so it's an open floor, and if it was crowded, you could spread out into the aisles. Likewise, you can see the arcade, and then above the arcade is a series of windows. They are clear-story windows. That's where the light into the nave came. So you can see that there are windows in the aisles, and there are windows above the nave and high in the nave, which serve not only to give light to the people who are standing in the nave itself, but also to light up the illustrations and the decorations. And you can see here a wonderful example of how these churches were decorated. They were not plain churches. Most of the ones you walk into now are essentially whitewashed. These murals that were painted, frescoes that were painted on the churches in their heyday had faded to a point where they needed either to be replaced or something else had to be done. And in many cases, in modern times, there has been a tendency to want to purify these churches, to cleanse them in a sense, and so they just whitewashed over these things. In some places, they have been sort of scraping off the whitewash to see what was underneath, and they see damaged old murals. You can also see how elaborate the carving at the capitals of the columns was. This work was really quite magnificent, done by professional stone carvers and masons, who I'll talk about in a little bit. You can also see the picture of Christ in the apse as you look forward to the end of this church. This is the entryway, the west front, the entry to all these churches, given that the orientation of the altar was to the east, the west was where you entered. The west front is therefore always the main entrance. This is the west front of the Abbey Church of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard, which is in Provence, not very far from Avignon. It's a wonderful example, and I'm sorry for the reproduction. It comes out of a book, as you can see the picture spread across the 2 pages. But it's a wonderful example of the way in which Roman architecture inspired Romanesque architecture. If you look below, you see the Arch of Constantine, which is in Rome, and which was copied in various parts of the empire. The Arch of Constantine was built in 315, and it was an inspiration. Its fundamental pattern and organization was an inspiration for the west fronts of many Romanesque churches. You can see that above the doors are timpani. They're spaces that are carved with scenes relating to the first coming and the second coming of Jesus. In the right you can see the scene of the crucifixion. In the center it is probably Christ in judgment. On the left I can't really make it out. But this is a nice example of the way in which this architecture mimicked the Roman architecture. This building is in Emilia, which is in central and eastern Italy. It's again an abbey church, a monastery church. It's in a region that includes Bologna, Modena, and Parma, and Reggio Emilia, major cities in this area. This is a nice, simple, straightforward west front of this abbey church. You can see its simplicity in structure. Note the porch, which often in these churches precedes the front doors. Note the 3 arches, which are common in this design. One of the things that the southern Romanesque developed, and particularly in Italy, but also in some parts of southern France and Spain, was this enormously tall, out of proportion, and either semi-attached or detached bell tower. Note that this bell tower had an architect lavish a lot of attention on it. It has a detailed design. The windows are very carefully structured to open and become broader and broader as you go to and those aren't really windows, they're galleries. As you go up, they're in that Romanesque arcade form. You can also see across the tower, horizontally, these small fake arcades that are carved into the surface. This was characteristic of a design that originated in southern Italy and spreads out. You see it all over, especially Italy and southern France and Spain. It's called the Lombard design. And so you're seeing a bell tower that is quite extraordinary, and the most famous of these is the next one we'll look at. Usually you see the Leaning Tower of Pisa independently in pictures. You don't realize that, in fact, it is part of a complex that includes the cathedral. It is the bell tower for the Cathedral of Pisa, and this is a building that was begun in 1173 but then built over a long period of time. But the building remained consistent with the original Romanesque design criteria, even though it really started at the beginning of the age of the Gothic and never became a Gothic cathedral. The bell tower was built very slowly, beginning in this period at the end of the 12th century, and it was built very slowly because it kept sinking. They had put it on the wrong kind of ground, and they kept waiting to see whether it was going to fall. It never did, and they eventually finished it up. And when I was there in the beginning of the 60s for the first time, I was actually able to climb it. I don't think you can now. Their engineering is better, and they know it's pretty dangerous. I don't think it's become that much more dangerous in the last 40 years, given how old it is, but folks have become more nervous about it. The building, as I say, it's separate from the cathedral. It looks a little bit like it's attached here, but there's actually space in between. And this is, again, if you look at this church, there are some features of it that are really quite wonderful. Aside from its size, and you can see here the height of the nave and the side aisles in the roof structures. But beyond that, if you were to study very carefully these lines of arcades that are on the facade of the cathedral, the west front that we're facing, and on the tower itself, you'd discover that one of the things that makes it less monotonous, you'd think that this pattern repeated over and over again, pretty soon you just block it out. But what keeps your eye engaged is the fact that those are all different heights. Not very much, but enough so that it animates the surface instead of deadening it. and that is an indication of how sophisticated the architects of this early period were. Now here's a primitive looking thing, and not merely because we have an old black and white photograph of it. This is an abbey church. It is in Maastricht, which is in the extreme south of the Netherlands. If you look in the map, you'll see that the Netherlands has a kind of finger that reaches to the south between France and Belgium. And in fact, this church is very close to Aachen, which was the capital of Charlemagne. What you're looking at is a kind of building which was typical of especially abbeys and some cathedrals that were built under the aegis of the imperial government, the German emperors in the 11th and 12th centuries. And they typically had this very large built-up part of the church on the west end, which architectural historians typically call the west works. What you would see here is that, if you went inside, was that in the upper floors above the entry level, which is where you enter the church and you're in the church proper, if you go up above that, you would find a private chapel for the king, for the emperor, and a throne room. So these places doubled as traveling palaces. And in fact, the German kings were constantly, and all the medieval kings of this period, the 11th and 12th century, were constantly on the road. It was the way they communicated with their people. The people didn't come to them, they went to their people. And moreover, because you couldn't transport food very effectively, especially large amounts of it that were needed to feed the royal court, which was quite enormous in terms of the number of people involved, the court instead traveled around the kingdom, living on royal estates, eating up all the food in that place and then moving on. And these churches which were built would serve the purposes of government as well as of religion in the periods when the emperor was resident. The two towers on either side of the westwork are not bell towers, but are stair towers. That's the way you got upstairs. This is a monastery church at Maria Lach, which is a small lake near Koblenz in western Germany. Koblenz is a city on the Rhine south of Cologne. As you can see, it was begun in 1093, but probably took several decades to complete. It is a kind of Romanesque church you would see in many places. And we are actually looking at the western end, even though you can see that rounded structure on the end of the church. That's not the apse, it's the opposite of the apse, it's the western end. You enter there, and above it is the westwork. It's not as impressive, perhaps, as the one we've seen at Maastricht, but it's a relatively large building that would house a chapel at least, and maybe an office up on top, and would be entered through the stairway towers on either side. I want you to notice the windows in the side of the church. You can see them both clear story and in the side of the aisles. The ones in the aisles are a little clearer for my purposes because I want you to notice how deep they are. The walls of this building are very thick to contain the weight and the thrust of the arches. I'll talk about that a little later. This is a roughly contemporary building. It's Speyer Cathedral. That's in central Germany, built under the aegis of the kings in the 11th century, the German emperors in the 11th century. It's been shored up. You can see the wire, the iron rods that are just ensuring that it doesn't buckle. And the reason why they have to do that is that the round arch that you see has tremendous outward thrust, so it endangers the walls. That's why the walls are so thick, because of that thrust. You can see the clear story windows here. The murals that you can see along the walls underneath those windows are modern. They're 19th century murals. Well, you've seen a couple of vaults, and here is a schematic representation of how the kinds of vaults they used. The common vault for the nave was a barrel vault, and you can see that over to the left. And then they used a groin vault, which are really two intersecting barrel vaults, were used in the aisles. So if you can imagine this, the barrel vault is sitting and supported by walls that are supported by these groin vaults, and that gives it much greater strength than it would otherwise have. The thrust on that round vault, that barrel vault, is immensely powerful to the outside. It just would flatten if it could. So the walls have to be very thick, and you can't break them with lots of windows. I mean, you have to be careful about weakening your walls with windows. But then if you use the groin vault on either side, you will strengthen the structure that holds that barrel vault in. And In the largest churches, these barrel vaults could get extremely big and high. The highest church in Christendom from the 12th century on until St. Peter's was built in the 16th century was the church at Cluny in Burgundy. And that barrel vault was 165 feet high. It was extraordinarily high, and it has since collapsed. The other vault is a rib vault, and the rib vault is a very important vault because it was used in the crypt. The crypt often functioned as a kind of basement, and it bore a huge amount of weight from the church above it. And so they developed this kind of ribbing which gave extra strength to the vaulting. And you'll notice that they also, in doing this, were forced to make the arches pointed. And over time they discovered that even though they were building these in the lower part of the church, they began to discover that they were very strong vaults, and that by pointing them, as you see here, the thrust was much more vertical down. That means you can lighten the walls. You don't have to contain these things as much. And the Gothic is ultimately going to be based on the pointed vault. Here's a wonderful representation of the barrel vault. This is at Vienne. Vienne is a city in eastern France. It was a major center of Roman administration and then became quite an important center of ecclesiastical administration. And this is the cathedral church there, and it is a wonderful example of Romanesque. You can see here how they painted the interior. The ceiling was painted with scenes from the Bible. They even painted the columns to make them look like marble. Again, that comes from Roman tradition. You saw that in the wall paintings, in the architectural wall paintings that came out of Pompeii and other Roman villas. And here you see it now in the medieval buildings. This is a monastery church of Vézelay, which is not very far from the Swiss border and the mountains. It sits on a little hill that I can tell you is a killer to climb on a bicycle, and in the midst of a bowl that's about 70-mile diameter. It's very interesting. You crest the hill, you can see the church from the crest of the hill 35 miles away. It's a stunning view. You then ride down into the bowl, which must have been either one hell of an asteroid or some kind of a volcanic collapse multi-millions of years ago. And you then get to this little hill and climb up to the church. This church is a huge church, especially for a monastery, because Vézelay was the starting point for pilgrimages to Rome and to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. And so the pilgrims gathered here and prayed for a good journey and so on. And they brought in huge amounts of money. I mean, they're tourists. That's what pilgrims are. And the monastery got quite wealthy, and it built this wonderful church, which is very elaborately carved, beautifully designed, and quite broad. And in making it so broad, the simple barrel vault that we just saw is not adequate, so they built the ribs to help hold up that heavy vaulting. This is a simple plan. We're going to see several of them. This one is of Maria Lach, which we saw earlier. I'm going to show it to you again in the next slide. You can see the stair towers on either end of what would be the westworks. Here, the westworks were modest by comparison to the ones at Maastricht, which we looked at, but they still existed. There would be at least a chapel or something above the entrance to the church. You can see the apse and the transept, the crossing aisle that makes the church into a cross. The altar would be where that darkened area to the east is, and beyond it is the chancel or the choir, and then the apse is the rounded part. You can also see here that there are two rounded small apses off the transepts. These would have been private chapels or small chapels, and you'll see those in the larger churches everywhere. You can see here the porch and then into the nave and the two aisles, and one on either side of the nave, and you can see how many meters you're dealing with. And so it gives you an idea of the scale of the church. Here again then is Maria Lach that we saw earlier and that we are seeing again here after looking at its plan. You can now imagine how the interior is organized. Here is the plan for Spire Cathedral. It is almost identical to the one we've just seen from Maria Lach, but it's a very much larger building. You can see that it has a simpler porch, but it has a single aisle on either side in the transept. And it's got a smaller chancel because, not being a monastery, it would not have the same need for a large area where the monks would pray 7 times a day. You can see how the apse operates. Here, I don't believe that those two small semicircles are chapels, but they might be off the transept. Here's a drawing of the Speyer Cathedral done by Kenneth J. Conant, who taught at Harvard in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Very famous medieval architectural historian, and he did a lot of these kinds of reconstructions to get an idea of what these churches looked like early on. In many cases, they have been altered on the exterior as well as the interior in order either to keep up with modern tastes or because they were in danger of falling down, and architects came in and did things to them that would keep them standing but made them look rather different. So architectural historians often have to reconstruct what they actually looked like in the past. And this is a good example. You're looking at the side of the church. You can see the west front. You can see the apse to the left. And it's quite a nice representation, and you can see how much like Maria Laach it looked in those days, but much larger. If you started off from Vézelay on the trip to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, one of the places you'd come to is Conch, a little town, a monastery, which was founded there in honor of Saint Foy, who was a martyr saint of Roman times. And they were a big pilgrim center on the way. People stopped off to worship at the shrine of Saint Foy, and therefore they were able to build a large church. And in this case, what you can see is that as the crowds came in, since the saints' relics were up by the altar, they really wanted the crowd up to the east end of the church. And so what the architects have done here is to add aisles to the transept. So not only does the nave have an aisle on each side, but now the transept has an aisle on each side, and that gives you a lot more area for people to gather. And you can see now several radiating chapels, these small semicircular apse chapels that surround the apse and are on the transepts, and that are places where pilgrims would be able to go for a quiet moment of prayer while they're in the church. When ultimately you got to Santiago de Compostela, and it was a very long trip, took months and months, could take more than a year under certain circumstances, depending where you were starting in Europe. You came to a great cathedral church that was built in the city starting around 1075, and it was largely complete by the 1130s. A big Romanesque basilica, and here you can see that it is doing exactly what the church of Saint Foy at Conch did. The nave has an aisle on either side, but so does the transept. And you can see the ambulatory, which runs around the altar. The altar is the squares in the east end of the church, and around the edge is an extra space called an ambulatory. You can see that here you have 5 radiating chapels from the apse and 2 each from each of the arms of the transept. This is a church built for pilgrims and for large crowds of people. And if you go there today, you will find yourself in a large crowd of people if you're there, particularly in the summer, because people are still making this pilgrimage and doing it on foot, and they're doing it on bicycles, and they're doing it by car. Here's a representation of the church at Santiago by Kenneth J. Conant again. In this case, when you're there, the church has been hemmed in by the city. It's almost impossible to get a view of it as a whole. Here we're looking at it from the apse, that is to say from the east end, and you can see the radiating chapels that we saw on the plan. You can see the way the towers are built. This is really quite a magnificent, large structure, and it is a classic piece of Romanesque work.